Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back at it again to talk about the comparison between Disc and Holy in both this Mythic Plus season and in Raids. With Mythic Week in the books, I wanted to kind of give you an idea of where I'm at and really where the specs are at. For a bit of a recap, this one got some buffs to its atonement healing, specifically in a dungeon environment just before the Mythic Plus season got started. And as I was getting myself geared up over the past couple weeks, I really noticed it coming into this season where it felt like this one had a pretty substantial power advantage once I got used to really timing my setups and timing when I was using my Shadow Covenant, my Void Wraith, my Squid pet on hand. There was a lot of moments where I would unfortunately send it in the wrong area, or I'd be sending it on cooldown or trying to maximize damage or something along those lines, and you kind of get caught out. But as I started getting more comfortable with the timings, with the setups, when I started getting more used to the next damage mechanic that could be killing off players, especially in some of the overtuned dungeons earlier in the week. I know they have some dungeon nerfs kind of coming into it. It seemed really noticeable. The other side of it is that most of the dungeons in this season are really about burst. I'm sure you guys have noticed it as well. They just had some nerfs to the ticking damage of the flame vents for Stone Vault and the Machinist boss. They reduced the dot duration for the City of Threads splice mechanic on the last boss. That's the ticking damage there. So most all the mechanics in these dungeons will have a few seconds of dot damage or a few seconds of pulsing damage, but it's not sustained. It's not rot damage. And so as a result, Disc just blasts healing for these things, especially when you know that they're going to happen, especially when you know that they're going to be incoming. Holy, on the other hand, has felt good, but in particular, especially early on when kicks were getting missed left and right and it was unexpected damage was going to be happening, the sustained output of Holy has felt very good, especially with Lightweaver being buffed in beta, your Trail of Light being cheaper to take since Dragonflight making it a one-pointer. There's a lot that is on hand that felt very strong for it, very good, and even having some AoE healing you could take advantage of with Oracle Priest with Piety has been very helpful, not only for the increased healing, but also the overheal protection where you can basically just GS yourself, pop Piety, and then start mashing heals and flash heals into yourself to have that AoE transfer basically from the overheal has been really good. But there's also a lot of times where you have to plan it really well, and you have to make sure that you're already full health, because if you're only just healing yourself a bunch and you're not over healing yourself, then there's no extra healing getting transferred to everybody else, and then you're super healthy, and then everybody else is dead on the floor. I would say for both specs, it's really noticeable with the lack of curse and poison effects going in with these dungeons. Thankfully, the latest patch notes also reduced the curse absorbs in Grimbatol from 2 debuffs getting applied at once to just 1 debuff getting applied, so that's going to help a crazy amount. On the Holy side, I think they clear those debuffs really well. On the Disc side, it seems to sometimes be a disaster, just like the monster wall falling and causing a cacophony of sounds and stuff like that. But the bright side of it, though, is that you could just use shields, pain sups, damage reduction to sort of delay and give you more time than you would otherwise actually have. So that's always going to be a nice thing to use. On the other hand, the lack of kick is enormously noticeable since there's just a ton of caster mobs. Honestly, this season, I've really been using mind control a lot more lately, just to grab faraway casters that are outside of a pack, having the mob walk into you, and then you can kind of decide if you want to hold it for the next 20 seconds or 25 seconds, or if you want to just right-click it, dismiss it, and then have it just appear in the pack. I've been doing a little bit of both depending on the groups that I've been in, and it's been insanely helpful because there's so many caster mobs in these dungeons that sometimes just holding on to a mob, even if it's not really doing much damage, and then killing it off later is going to greatly increase your success rate in a lot of these keys. And honestly, in a lot of the pug groups that you have on hand. So my verdict for M+ is that Disc is definitely noticeably stronger in terms of its overall output. A big reason for it is the independent tuning that it has for Mythic Plus, where it does 100% more atonement healing in dungeons. Most of the dungeon output is really, most of the dungeon healing profile, I should say, is about burst damage. And so being able to plan out and reverse that burst damage is really insanely strong. And Voidweaver finally feels like how I was hoping it would feel in like early alpha, where it's like a nice replacement for your lack of Shadow Covenant uptime. It actually feels really noticeably powerful now in dungeons after the buffs that they had going on. And so I would say that Disc is probably a tier below Preservation and Totemic Shaman right now for keys. I think it's at that like A tier right now with Paladin and Mistweaver, and it might even be a little bit above them in Mythic Plus at the moment. And that's kind of where my mindset is at, because the damage that it does is really strong. The PI and the extra damage it provides to your team is really, really strong. The extra stamina is strong for the crazy burst damage. There's a lot of areas where you can get people stacked up in barrier. Rapture feels good to utilize. The extra shields, the huge shields you provide to your allies are very meaty and very noticeable. So yeah, I think like Disc is absolutely blasting in this season, and I think we're very much leaning for a Disc M Plus season. While Holy feels good, I would say, like decent, there's a lot of moments where if you don't plan out how you're using your piety, it feels like you get a little bit punished. And so I'd like to see something if they're able to make certain buffs specifically for a dungeon environment, but I'm not exactly sure how they would be able to go about doing that. So if you have ideas, I'd love to be able to hear what your thoughts are going to be. For the incoming raid, however, it's been a little bit of an opposite feel. The big area where you want to determine if your spec feels good in a raid is also dependent upon every other healer in the game at the moment, since you're interacting with all of them, right? And this has notably been the area where I've noticed that Disc, while it feels pretty good as a ramp healer, I had a lot of fun healing Sikrin, for example, as Discipline. I absolutely noticed that your lunch gets eaten by Preservation Evokers, and it gets eaten very, very quickly. Consume Flame, which is the passive coming from the Flame Shaper Evokers, so when you cast Engulf, it detonates your Dream Breath for an explosion of healing, is just crazy, crazy powerful. Having it, obviously, with like Dream Breath, like hitting Stasis, a 1-rank Dream Breath into double Engulf casts, and then doing it again a few seconds later is just crazy burst output for your team. And so you really have ramps that are sort of taken from you as the Preservation Evokers are just becoming more and more dominant, and that makes it more difficult for you to get high value ramps, since you have to commit a lot of time, mana, resources, you can't really move very much, all of that kind of stuff in order to successfully ramp. And your barrier is also a quantifiable gain. Like, you can see how much damage is mitigated by barrier in raid fights with the mitigation tab on Warcraft logs. And so when you can compare that mitigation value to output, it still seems like the output gains of Preservation right now is outweighing the utility of the barrier on hand. You're seeing it for Race to World first. I'm seeing it in my own raid progression as well. Just using the barrier feels decent, but being able to blast so much healing to outweigh that strength is just a lot more noticeable. And so as a result, I think for a lot more of my raid progression, I'm going to end up doing more of my cutting edge and Hall of Fame progression as Holy. For the rest of the raid fights, I might be able to eke out some Disc onto Anzarek, but we'll still have to see what that's going to bring to the table. It still seems like we're heading towards more of a Holy angle in the raid. Holy, of course, is doing tremendous amounts of spot healing with Lightweaver, and it wasn't something we really got a chance to test a lot of in beta. Noticeably, Holy Priest was bugged in beta, where their 4-set bonus was causing you to like double cast spells, and it was costing you mana, and so you'd basically super insanely quickly. Noticeably, Heal and Lightweaver itself got buffed just before like the last weekend that we had of testing, so there was only like 1 week to really mess around and play around with it. And so it was a weird situation where you were looking at like Prayer of Healing and Circle of Healing not really doing much output, but giving you more Sanctifies. But as they kept buffing a lot of your single target output, then the strength of just building up more Serenities and building really strong single target healing was actually just outweighing using a lot of your AoE spells. And so while there's actually pretty decent balance with raid builds and there's good variety with if you really wanted to run a specific build, it just is much more effective healing running in a build like Lightweaver, where you can control a lot of your spot healing, triage healing, and putting a lot of priority healing into players that are in need. Noticeably, Paladin was insane for its single target healing in beta, but they've, like every time that they get reworked, got nerfed a number of different times. So their spot healing is still good, but it's not as insane as it was before, and so they're not just carrying the burden of like doing all the single target healing for the raid. I'd expect a lot of guilds to be running with at least one Preservation Evoker, maybe even a Shaman, Paladin, and then like a Holy Priest that's more or less what our composition is going to be for this incoming raid, for the rest of our raid fights. We're currently working on Overnax, and a setup like that means that having like the Paladin and the Priest taking over all like the spot healing in the raids kind of allows everybody else to just blast tons of output, which works out really well since this raid has a huge amount of like spot heal requirements as you get into later encounters. Overnax has those massive heal absorbs that need to be topped off whenever you're breaking out one of the eggs. The debuff that you drop puts a massive heal absorb onto you. When you go into Nexus Princess, the debuffs from Queensbane from those dots as well require a huge amount of spot healing. When I was doing Rashananon, I noticed that my tanks were getting obliterated and I just needed to be like babysitting them hardcore. And so I've already recrafted my weapon. I had my weapon set up for disc. I recrafted the weapon, got it set for Holy. I regemmed, re-enchanted my gear, spent a lot of gold to be able to do it, and it looks like I'm building myself up for a Holy progression for pretty much the rest of the incoming raid. When possible, you know, when I can, I'm going to try to go through those fights again as disc and stuff like that. But unfortunately, it's like a combination of Evoker's ramp style being like easier to execute than disc, if more efficient, higher output than disc at the moment. Still just a lot of work to do it as disc properly, and health pools don't really stay that low for long. There's not really a lot of rot damage, and so disc will basically blast for the first 3 or 4 seconds of its ramp, but the rift ends up lasting 8 seconds. And so even if you deployed your rift, cast your atonements, extended their duration, then start casting all your damage abilities, it's like a 3-second window or 4-second window where you're really doing the brunt of your damage. And you could produce a good burst, but what Preservation's able to do is basically stretch out their spells to like capture all the healing from one burst out of Overnax, burst everybody up to full, and then cast another Engulf for like the next burst. They're just more flexible in their healing profile to deal with whatever the fights are going to bring them. Whereas disc, you need to like blast a ton for like 4 seconds, and like that's about all you can do because of how atonements sort of limit you. And so I love playing disc and I love how the ramp play style works, but it's almost like they've kind of built another ramp healer that can do what you do more efficiently, more flexibly. And then that kind of just brings you down and makes you feel a little bit worse as a result. So my hope, honestly, is that there's some kind of revamp or change to how Disciplin's raid gameplay works. I think that the spec is going to do better later on in the expansion when you get closer to mechanics that are going to one-shot you outright, and then barrier becomes less about how much HPS value are you getting, but it's actually just like life-saving having the barrier down. That's something that I think was kind of noticeable in Emirjasil with the double disc setup. If you remember, dropping like the roots on Tindral and just having barrier down to survive that hit was huge in that environment, where health pools are like much spikier at the end of expansions than they are at the beginning of expansions. So that's something to keep an eye on. But I would really love to see a revamp and kind of fixing a lot of the dead talent nodes that Discipline has with like the 1105 anniversary like patch that they have going on, because it seems like they have some revamps happening for like Monk and for Druid, some changes for Paladin, but noticeably Priest didn't really get a ton of talent changes going into the War Within, and we're still kind of just waiting to see what else that they're going to have in store for us. So that's my plan. That's kind of where I'm at with Holy versus Disc at the moment. If you have any other questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. I also write the guides for Wowhead for Holy and Disc Priest. We also have our videos for both the specs for both Raids and Mythic Plus, and we have more updates to come with more tips for dungeons, raids, and the works coming in our written pages. So keep an eye out for those as well. Huge thank you to our patrons who make all this content possible, and if you'd like to join them, check it out in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.